Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today I will be walking through my ranking of every winning game in the history of US Survivor. This is a project that I've been wanting to make for a long time, but before jumping into the list, it's important to cover some of the ground rules. Everyone ranks Survivor winners differently, so for me, there were three big factors directing my ranking. First, there's strategic dominance. In other words, how much control did a particular winner hold in navigating the season? Further, how did the winner wield that power to their advantage? Were they capable of identifying the optimal path to a win? It's important to acknowledge out of the gate here that historically there are social barriers in place for contestants attempting a dominant play style. Especially in the early seasons of the show, we see primarily men take on this approach. With recent winners like D on Survivor 45, I think we are getting closer to a point where anyone can play a strategically dominant game. I understand that some people hate ranking Survivor winners based on dominance due to those societal factors, but it's the kind of ranking that I'm personally most interested in. If you want to rank Survivor winners based on another set of criteria, you are more than welcome to do so. The second big factor in my ranking is social insulation. In my opinion, the best Survivor winners are those who maintain loyal allies such that they are safe regardless of the outcome of immunity challenges. Throughout this ranking, you will hear me knock players for needing challenge wins or needing idle plays. Obviously, the ability to win a challenge or utilize an idol correctly are positive attributes for a player assessment, but when I'm looking strictly at winning games, I ideally want to see winners who avoided the target in its entirety. It's also worth acknowledging that relying on challenges or idols puts more power into the decisions of production. Different challenges play to different strengths, so by relying on challenges to reach the end, there's an element of luck in that players are hoping that production selects a challenge that they can win. Yes, there is luck in the social strategy side of Survivor as well, but I feel that component of the game puts more power into the players themselves. The last major criteria for my ranking is win equity. I value this component the least as there's a theoretical element when it comes to win equity. Obviously, all of these winners receive the necessary jury votes on their particular seasons, but I think it's important to at least consider the other possible final tribal council combinations. Some of the best Survivor winners are those who win a jury vote regardless of who they sit next to in the end. With all the criteria out of the way, we can jump into the list, and I've actually organized all of these contestants according to 9 separate tiers. This first tier includes contestants that fall into one of 3 buckets. You have the winners that relied on production-infused twists, you have winners that relied on extended immunity win streaks, and you got winners that were just clueless for most of the season. So at 47, the worst winner in the history of Survivor, to no one's surprise, is Chris Underwood from Survivor Edge of Extinction. When I started developing this ranking, I had a feeling that Chris would rank towards the bottom for the simple fact that he is the only winner in Survivor history to win the show after getting voted out. That fact alone dropped Chris to this bottom section of the list, as he fundamentally failed in the game's central goal of surviving each tribal council. What's even worse, though, are the logistics surrounding Chris's first elimination, as he's voted out due to his own poor play. When Chris's Manu tribe loses their 3rd straight immunity challenge, that group is initially prepared to take out Wendy, who hid the tribe's flint and injured her ankle. Theoretically, Chris should have had no issues surviving that round. His name isn't even on the board until he tries flipping the vote onto Wentworth, and through that attempt, the rest of the tribe bands together against him. Once voted out of the game, Chris's Survivor legacy is essentially saved through circumstances outside his control with the introduction of the Edge of Extinction twist. That gimmick provided Chris with a massive advantage, as he could sit out of the game for the next 27 days and connect with future members of the jury. By the time Chris returned to Survivor on day 35, he held an exact blueprint of how to win the season. He knew exactly who needed to go home at Final 6, Final 5, and Final 4. Every other winner on this list did not have the luxury of engaging with jury members following their eliminations. They needed to create that winning game plan without assistance from the jury itself. When Chris returns to the game at Final 6, I still don't think that he plays particularly well en route to the end. At Final 6, he convinces Lauren to waste her idol on him, which is probably his best strategic move of the season. At Final 5, Chris only survives through a successful idol play, On one hand, you can credit Chris for identifying himself as the target, but on the other hand, that idol was only valid through that round. Playing it in that spot was a no-brainer. Let's also not forget that Chris was handed that idol from production as a reward for returning to the game through the Edge of Extinction. This means that when Chris comes back at Final 6, he only needs to survive one straightforward tribal council. Even though Chris gets the flashy moment of playing his idol in front of the jury, the fact that Chris needed the idol to begin with is a major negative on his resume. Then at the Final 4, Chris makes the big move of throwing himself into fire-making against Rick Devens, which, again, I don't find very impressive considering that Chris knew about Devens' high jury stock through his conversations on the Edge. So I look at Chris's win as one that is very dependent on the influence of production. When writing this list, I was open to ranking Chris somewhere else in the bottom tier, but given the mistakes in his elimination round, as well as his decisions upon returning to the game, I had no other choice but to place him here at number 47. On to number 46, we have a player from one of Survivor's most chaotic seasons in Bob Crowley, the winner of Survivor Gabon. On the surface, I think Bob's game is one where he's poorly positioned every step of the way, and in spite of that underdog status, he's never fully respected by the jury. That lack of win equity is the major factor that dropped Bob to 46, below the winner that we will discuss at 45. So Bob starts the season on the Coda tribe, where he works his way into the majority 5-person alliance, but unbeknownst to Bob, he's number 5 in that group. By the tribe swap section of the game, Bob is actually pushed out of the alliance in its entirety as Randy takes his spot. Amidst these shifting alliance dynamics, Bob remains completely oblivious. In fact, he intended on rolling with that original Coda alliance into the merge where, if they took control of the numbers, Bob is the first player they would have cut from their group. In a weird way, Bob benefits from the second tribe swap that knocks Marcus out of the game, as it prevents him from following his initial plan of riding with the Coda players. From the Marcus vote at the final 10 onwards, Bob is on the bottom with no real strategic agency. He loses all of his Coda allies between the final 10 and the final 7. During that stretch, Bob makes some ridiculous decisions that actively burn his relationships with members of the jury, the most notable being him crafting a fake idol for Randy. The only positive in that section of Bob's game is his threat level management. The fact that Marcus, Charlie, Randy, and Corinne are all targeted before Bob can be seen as a positive, but I don't think that Bob's survival was really due to anything intentional on his end. I think that Bob was simply perceived as a non-threat, which is later confirmed as he barely wins the season against Susie and Sugar, two of the worst finalists in the history of the show. At Final 6 and Final 5, Bob is a bottom feeder whose entire game is dependent on winning individual immunities. Without immunity in either of those rounds, Bob gets voted out. The Final 4 is one of the few shining lights in Bob's game as he loses individual immunity, and it initially looks like he's the consensus target. At the 11th hour, though, Sugar steps in. She aligns with Bob and gives him a fighting chance in fire-making against Maddie. I'd love to give Bob credit for this last-minute alliance with Sugar, but I feel that their connection was more so based out of Sugar's life experiences rather than the active work of Bob himself. Prior to the filming of Gabon, Sugar's father passed away, and Bob presented himself as a parental figure to Sugar. Anyways, Bob wins that fire-making challenge against Maddie, but it's important to note that Bob intended on running with Maddie to the final tribal council, where he would have lost. As mentioned earlier, Bob narrowly wins the season against Susie and Sugar, who were widely perceived as two of the worst players in the eyes of the jury. Bob receives 4 out of 7 jury votes, one of which came from Randy, who Bob burned on the way out. The fact that Susie came 1 vote away from winning this season is absolutely absurd. I don't think that Bob had much win equity on Gabon. I believe that he loses the season in most other final tribal council combinations. He for sure loses to Maddie, who places 4th, as well as Kenny, who placed 5th. So Bob's game is one where he's constantly operating from the bottom and making incorrect reads from that position. There are other Survivor winners who work outside the majority, but they rank ahead of Bob due to their ability to flip the game in their favor. So out of those winners who were not voted out, I see Bob as the worst of the bunch. He ranks here at 46. On to number 45, we got a winner whose game is similar to Bob's in that he's perpetually on the bottom of his main alliance, and by the end game, he's completely isolated and relying on immunity wins. It's the sole survivor of Survivor Nicaragua, Fabio. Fabio's win is a sloppy game from beginning to end. Out of the gate, he's on the outside of the LaFleur tribe as he's excluded from the Shannon vote. At the tribe swap, Fabio is switched into a group where his original alliance holds the numbers advantage, so he's in a solid spot there. During that swap section of the game, Fabio establishes an alliance with Marty, and he proceeds to lose Marty 2 rounds later at the final 11. And from that point forward, Fabio is on the bottom with no real strategic agency. He also gets very lucky with the double quit at the final 9 and the final 8. With Nyanka and Purple Kelly quitting the game, Fabio is essentially pushed 2 rounds closer to the final tribal. There is a world where, without that double quit, Fabio goes home in that mid-merge section of the game. Then at final 7, Fabio's group fails to pull Sash onto their side, and he's excluded from the Benry blind side. By the time we hit the final 6, Fabio is the consensus target, and he needs 3 straight individual immunity wins to reach the final tribal council. When Fabio sits at the end against Chase and Sash, he squeaks out the win, picking up 5 out of 9 jury votes. That win equity is the main factor pushing Fabio ahead of Bob in my ranking. Unlike Bob, Fabio wins most other final tribal council combinations. He probably beats Holly, who places 4th, or Dan, who places 5th. I'd also say that while Bob and Fabio were both positioned on the bottom, I feel that Fabio made fewer active mistakes from that spot. Fabio claims that he put on this persona of the clueless surfer bro, but I feel that he just didn't know what was going on for most of the season. And in those times where he was included in the vote, he was pulled over as a number. He never held much agency in actually directing the season. Combine that lack of control with his reliance on challenges, and I'll put Fabio here at number 45. On to number 44, we have another winner who greatly benefited from production interference. This is a player that I considered ranking as low as 46, if not for his control in the early game. But anyways, here at 44, I have Ben Driebergen, the winner of Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers. Everyone remembers Ben for the 2 luck-based scenarios surrounding his winning game. First, you have Ben finding 3 immunity idols that help him bulldoze his way from the final 7 to the final 4. Throughout that entire stretch, Ben is on the bottom, and without those idols, he's voted out of the game. The second lucky component in Ben's win is obviously the introduction of the forced fire-making challenge. At Final 4, Ben loses individual immunity, and it looks like he's dead to rights. Every remaining player was prepared to vote against Ben, but production introduces that twist, which gives Ben a second life. I don't have an issue with fire-making in later seasons because those players knew about the gimmick beforehand. The cast of Triple H could not game plan around forced fire-making, which greatly plays to Ben's benefit given his constant operation on the bottom. Those lucky factors automatically drop Ben to this bottom tier of the list, and his actively bad decisions in the second half of the game are what land him this low within that bottom tier. With 3 idols in the post-merge, Ben could theoretically control the season, but he oftentimes uses those idols ineffectively. His idol play at the final 7 is easily his best as he takes Lauren out with a single vote. At final 6, he plays his idol before the votes are even cast. First, the fact that production allowed Ben to play the idol early is just ridiculous, but second, by playing that idol early, Ben loses the element of surprise. He tries to rally the other players against Mike, and he completely fails as Ashley goes home. Then at Final 5, Ben saves himself again with an idol, but he's unable to take Devin out of the game. Ben's reliance on idols, as well as his decisions with those idols, are really bad. The primary factor boosting Ben ahead of Bob and Fabio is his control in the first half of the season. Ben's game prior to the final 7 is respectable. He starts Triple H well positioned on the Heroes tribe. At the merge, he works within the majority in taking out the Healers for 3 straight rounds. At Final 9, Ben operates as a secret agent, pretending to align with the likes of Ryan and Chrissy, only to flip against them in the following round. It's not a dominant performance by any means, but it's one where Ben is constantly in the loop. I think Ben spends much less of the season scraping by on the bottom than those other winners below him on the list. As mentioned earlier, Ben loses control at Final 7, but I don't think he made many active mistakes to cause that loss of agency. I think the other players did not want to ride with Ben to the end due to his background. As a former Marine, Ben defined the hero label for the season, and people didn't want to compete against that storyline. You can also credit Ben in terms of win equity, as he probably beats anyone from the final 7 onwards in a jury vote. So like I said earlier, I really considered ranking Ben as the second worst winner of Survivor due to the fire-making challenge incident, but his gameplay up until his downfall at the final 7 was strong enough to earn him the number 44 spot. At 43, we have a winner who I feel is generally overrated by the Survivor community. I did not find this contestant's winning game all that impressive when she first won her season, and my opinion has not changed much over time. It's Michele Fitzgerald from Survivor Co. Wrong. Michelle's win checks the same boxes as the other winners in this tier. She works on the bottom for most of the season, she relies on immunity wins to reach the final tribal council, and she has some incredibly lucky breaks in her game that ultimately facilitate her win. So from the beginning, Michele is on the outside of the beauty tribe, and while the edit hypes up this dynamic of the men versus the women, it's been reported after the season that Michele and Nick were positioned on the bottom. Had Michelle's tribe lost immunity in those first 5 episodes, she's in serious danger. Now, you can partially credit Michele for her contributions in tribal challenges, but you need to admit that there are other factors at play there. Michele does not attend a tribal council for the entire pre-merge, which again is very lucky. It's something we rarely see through the history of the show. At the merge, Michele is initially in the majority, contributing to the Nick and Debbie votes, but she doesn't hold much control in that section of the game. Aubrey and Sydney are really the ones running the show there. Then at Final 8, Michele is left out of the plan to knock out Scott Pollard, and from that point forward, she's completely powerless. At Final 7, she loses her number 1 ally in Julia. Michele contributes to that vote and later props up this move at the final tribal as the moment that helped her integrate within the majority, but that's not really true. The opposing alliance targets Michele multiple times after the Julia boot. At Final 6, Michele is used as the backup plan in the Jason vote, so that stretch between the Final 8 and Final 6 is pretty bad for her in terms of her lack of strategic agency, but I will credit Michele for her threat level management. Michele had positioned herself as the lowest possible threat amidst those players on the bottom. Unfortunately, by the Final 5, Michele is clearly presented as the biggest target on the board, and she relies on a Joe medical evacuation and an immunity win to reach the final tribal. That entire saga surrounding the Joe medevac is the biggest knock against Michele's winning game. When Joe gets pulled from the season for overeating on reward, the Final 5 immunity challenge turns into the Final 4 reward challenge. Michele loses that challenge to Aubrey, meaning if Joe stays on the island, Michele is vulnerable at Final 5 in a spot where she's more than likely taken out. So long story short, the Joe medical evacuation saves Michele and pushes her just one immunity challenge away from winning the season. At Final 4, Michele wins both immunity and the juror removal advantage. She makes a correct read in removing Neil from the jury as an obvious pro-Aubrey vote, but it's important to acknowledge that Michele fails to even achieve her ideal final tribal council combination. Michele intended on taking Aubrey out at Final 4, but she's unable to pull Ty onto her side. That results in a fire-making challenge between Aubrey and Sydney, which Aubrey wins. Granted, Michele wins a jury vote against either Aubrey or Sydney, so that round was not detrimental to her game, but it's still another instance of Michele failing to take control. The only positive I see with Michelle's endgame is her win equity, as she beats any other player at the Final 5. And while that win equity is impressive, I think the route to victory is very rocky. Michele has numerous lucky scenarios that play out on this season, like her challenge success in the pre-merge, as well as the Joe medical evacuation. It's an uninspiring win in my book. I'll rank her here at 43. On to number 42, we have a winner whose game is largely defined by immunity wins. I think this contestant has a serious argument for the best winning physical game in Survivor history, but the rest of this run leaves a lot to be desired. It's Mike Holloway, the winner of Survivor Worlds Apart. Out of every winner discussed so far, Mike might be the worst in terms of his threat level management. Through his hyper-aggressive play at the auction, Mike isolates himself from the rest of the cast, and he needs immunity every round starting at the final 9. Unlike some of the winners discussed earlier like Ben, Mike's positioning on the bottom is entirely his own doing. Now, to his credit, Mike bulldozes his way to the final tribal from the final 9 through more traditional means than a winner like Ben. He wins 5 individual immunities and plays an idol correctly at the final 7. At the same time, though, the fact that Mike needed immunity through most of the merge reveals an inherent flaw with his game. Mike never built the social bonds necessary to carry him through the post-merge. In fact, you can make the argument that outside of Chris Underwood, Mike is the worst winner on this list, strictly in terms of strategic positioning. With all that in mind, I still think that Mike plays well both within the majority in the pre-merge and on the bottom in the post-merge. In the first half of the game, he works within the main power structure on the Escameca tribe, aligning with the likes of Rodney, Dan, and Kelly. At the tribe swap, Mike gets an upper hand over Rodney by flipping the vote onto Joaquin. Then in the early merge, Mike works as a central member of the majority in picking off members of the no-collar tribe between the final 11 and the final 10. When Mike's primary alliance turns against him at the final 9, he still finds a way to impact the game on a strategic level. Mike is a distinct winner in that regard. Most other contestants who rely on challenges in the endgame generally forfeit all strategic agency. Mike continues to influence the direction of the season despite his poor positioning. He threatens to play an idol at Final 8, which reveals the cracks of the dominant alliance. At Final 7, Mike solidifies an alliance with Carolyn, and he holds substantial agency in pulling Sierra onto their side to vote out Tyler. Then at Final 5, Mike serves as the essential swing vote that knocks out Sierra. All of this is to say that through that back section of the game, Mike finds a way to control the vote while on the bottom. I'd also note that Mike was very aware of his status as the biggest threat, and he intentionally knocks out other challenge beasts as a way to improve his own chances of winning out. So Mike's win on Worlds Apart is definitely a flawed victory. It's an all-time bad performance from a positioning perspective, but when accounting for his agency throughout the season, I will rank Mike here at 42. On to number 41, I have the most recent winner of Survivor in Rachel from Survivor 47. Throughout our coverage of 47, I was never high on Rachel's game. In the final tribal council of that season, Andy compares Rachel's performance to the likes of Mike Holloway and Ben Driebergen. I completely agree with that assessment, and all 3 of them ranked in this bottom tier. I actually considered ranking Rachel below Mike for the simple reason that she held less control. At least with Mike, he ran the pre-merge section of the game. I don't know if there's a real stretch on 47 where Rachel is directing the season. More often than not, she's out of the loop, and other players don't want to work with her. When Rachel gains agency in 47, it's typically through production-infused advantages, not her social gameplay. The main reason why I put Rachel ahead of Mike is her threat level management. Neither one of these winners are strong in that arena, but Rachel is slightly better. Mike is the consensus target every round starting at the final 9, and that does not happen for Rachel until the final 7. So taking a deeper look, Rachel is initially in the majority on the Gada tribe in their first tribal council, but she then falls outside the main power structure. She's blindsided in their second tribal council, where she loses her number 1 ally in Annika. I think that Rachel deserves a lot of criticism for that round. Postseason, Sierra reported that she elected to flip against them because Rachel and Annika presented themselves as an obvious pair. Moving on to the merge, you got the split tribal at Final 12, where Rachel is initially swapped into a horrible position as she's outnumbered 5-1 by the opposing Tuku alliance. It's an unlucky spot for her, and leading up to tribal council, it looks like we're headed towards a unanimous Rachel vote. She's then saved by factors completely outside her own control, with Saul playing the take-your-pick advantage. Now, you could credit Rachel for her connection to Saul, but I see this move more so as anti-Tuku rather than pro-Rachel. I think that Saul would have made the same decision regardless of which non-Tuku member was sitting in Rachel's spot. At the end of the day, I still look at this round as a slight negative for Rachel because she was nearly voted out. Plus, there are other winners far ahead of Rachel on the list who received similar swaps, and they survived purely through their social gameplay. In the early merge, Rachel works outside the majority alliance. She loses 2 of her allies back-to-back in Sierra and Saul. She has a solid shot in the dark play at Final 11, which saves her idol for later in the post-merge. That move improves my opinion of Rachel, the Survivor player, but it still occurs in a spot where she's losing control of the game. Around the Final 8, Rachel turns her game around. She builds this 5-person underdog alliance where she's positioned in the middle. She volunteers for a journey to prevent the players on the bottom from acquiring an advantage. She gets lucky there in that she wins a 1 out of 3 rock draw to acquire a vote block, but then we get to the Final 7, which is an absolute disaster for Rachel. She's the original target of Operation Italy, where without immunity, she's potentially taken out. She's then blindsided by the Caroline vote, which basically breaks her game. Following that move, Rachel loses the trust of Teenie, and she's on the bottom for the rest of the season. If Rachel is vulnerable in any subsequent round, she's voted out. At Final 6, we see Rachel take out Andy through an idol play, which impresses the jury. It's important to note that, according to postseason interviews, Sue was the one really campaigning against Andy while Rachel wanted to knock out Sam. It's great that Rachel takes the credit for that Andy boot, but it's another instance of Rachel not really directing the ship. From that point forward, Rachel wins out. She makes the correct moves at Final 5 in taking out Genevieve and Final 4 in not stepping into firemaking. She then reaches the final tribal against Sam and Sue, where she wins in a 7-1-0 jury vote. I gotta give Rachel a lot of credit for her general win equity. I think that Rachel beats just about anyone in the end, outside maybe Genevieve. So overall, I think that Rachel's win showcases a lot of great skills for a Survivor player, but I wouldn't describe it as a strategically dominant victory. Like the other winners in this tier, it's a game where Rachel depends on immunities and works primarily outside the majority alliance. It's the worst winning game of the new era. It's here at number 41. So that's everything I have for this podcast. Come back next week where I'll walk through the numbers 40 through 31 spots.